Picture this. Antoine Walker isn't a rumor, isn't a cautionary tale whispered in locker rooms. He's a real NBA champion with a ring, a resume, and a career that paid him like a king. The kind of career that makes people assume the ending is guaranteed. You see the headlines, you hear over 100 million earned, and public estimates later put his NBA salary earnings at roughly $108 million. And yes, in 2006, he did get the ring, an NBA title with the Miami Heat, and your brain automatically fills in the rest: security, comfort, legacy. But Antoine Walker's story flips that assumption on its head, because the most shocking part isn't that he made it, it's how fast the ground vanished beneath him. In the public imagination, athletes don't run out of money. Not the ones who played big minutes on big stages, not the ones who were all-stars, not the ones who tasted the loudest kind of success the league can offer. And yet, Antoine Walker ended up in a place that felt impossible from the outside, filing for bankruptcy. And in 2010, filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, facing the brutal reality that the checks stopped coming while the lifestyle kept charging interest. And that's when the picture started to crack. Because Antoine Walker's downfall wasn't one single reckless weekend. It wasn't just one foolish purchase, one flashy car, one oversized mansion. It was something far more dangerous, a chain reaction. A series of choices that seemed harmless when the money was pouring in, and became fatal when the faucet turned even slightly. And when people say, he spent it on luxury, that's usually a lazy summary. The real story has layers. It's about identity. It's about what happens when a young man becomes rich before he becomes stable. It's about the kind of pressure that makes you feel like you have to prove you're successful every time you walk into a room. It's about the people who come close when you're winning and what they do when you're not. Because Antoine Walker didn't just play basketball, he played a role, the star, the provider, the larger-than-life personality who had to look like he was on top, even on nights when he wasn't. And in that role, spending stops feeling like spending. It starts feeling like breathing. So tonight, we're going to follow Antoine Walker from the first wave of stardom to the moment the illusion cracked. We'll track the rise, the hype, the pressure, the swagger, the big city spotlight, and we'll track the fall, the debts, the bad decisions, the deals that looked smart until they weren't. It's a story about the dark side of fame, the part nobody celebrates when the confetti is falling. Because when Antoine Walker finally had everything people dream about, he was already walking toward the cliff. Before Antoine Walker ever wore an NBA jersey, before Boston fans argued over his shot selection, before his name showed up next to words like bankruptcy, he was a kid in Chicago, a city that doesn't hand you anything for free. Chicago teaches you early, if you want to be seen, you have to take your space. If you want to survive, you have to be tough. And if you want more than what you were born into, you have to believe in something bigger than your block. Antoine Walker's early environment mattered, not in the Hollywood way where every detail is dramatic, but in the quiet way that shapes habits, the kind of habits that follow you even when you're rich. Because money changes what you can buy, but it doesn't automatically change what you believe about life. And Antoine Walker grew up learning to think fast, move fast, and grab opportunities before someone else does. That mindset is powerful for basketball. It can also be dangerous for adulthood. In Chicago, basketball isn't just a sport, it's a language, it's a reputation. It's a way to earn respect without asking for it. Antoine Walker didn't just play, he built an identity. Confidence became part of his brand long before branding was a thing players talked about. And confidence, when it's rewarded early, can turn into something heavier later, the feeling that rules don't apply to you the same way they apply to everyone else. As Antoine Walker's talent grew, so did the expectations around him. Coaches, friends, neighbors. Everybody starts treating the future star differently. People start talking like the outcome is inevitable. They start counting your success before you've even lived it. And when that happens, it does something subtle to your psychology. It makes you feel responsible not just for yourself, but for everyone watching. That's the first crack in the foundation. Because for many athletes, especially ones who rise fast, money doesn't just represent comfort. Money becomes proof. Proof you made it. Proof you're real. Proof you didn't waste the gift. And that hunger to prove it, to show it, can be louder than any financial advice. So when Antoine Walker finally reached the next level, he didn't arrive as a blank slate. He arrived with a full backpack, ambition, pride, pressure, and a deep belief that the only safe move is to go bigger. Chicago gave Antoine Walker toughness. It gave Antoine Walker swagger. It gave Antoine Walker the kind of confidence that makes you fearless on the court. But it also planted something else, something that would haunt him later. The idea that looking successful is the same thing as being secure. When Antoine Walker stepped into the Kentucky program, he wasn't walking into a normal college experience. Kentucky basketball is its own universe, a place where pressure isn't occasional, it's permanent. The lights are brighter, the expectations are louder, the fans don't just watch, they live inside the outcome. And for Antoine Walker, Kentucky became the first real rehearsal for the life he was about to enter. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Because in a system like that, you can't survive on flair alone. You need focus, you need stamina, you need the ability to take criticism without folding. Antoine Walker learned quickly that being a star means being evaluated every night, every practice, every interview. You're not just playing for wins, you're playing for a narrative. At Kentucky, Antoine Walker's name started to carry weight. The scouts watched, the cameras followed, and once that machine turns on, something changes inside you. You start understanding that basketball can take you places ordinary life never could. It can make you famous, it can make you rich, it can make you untouchable. But here's the part most people miss. That dream, once it becomes real, can create a new kind of anxiety. Because now you're not just chasing success, you're trying not to lose it. You're trying not to disappoint everyone who's already counting your future like it's money in their pocket. Antoine Walker's college run helped solidify his status as a top prospect. It pushed him into the conversation as a player who belonged on the biggest stage. It wasn't just about stats. It was about presence, about looking like someone who could handle the NBA spotlight. And that's where the seed gets planted. If you can handle the spotlight, you start to believe you can handle everything. You start believing your instincts are enough. You start believing you'll always land on your feet. That belief is what makes a player fearless in the fourth quarter. It's also what can make a grown man sign papers he doesn't fully understand, trust people he shouldn't trust, and spend money like the future is a guaranteed contract. At Kentucky, Antoine Walker learned to thrive in pressure. He learned to perform when the arena is shaking. He learned to carry expectations without showing fear. But the same system that builds stars also trains them to think in moments, in wins, in highlights, in the next big step. And when you live like that, the long-term plan can become the first casualty. Because the NBA doesn't just pay you, it tests you. And Antoine Walker was about to find out that the toughest opponent in his life wouldn't always be standing across from him on the court. Draft night is sold like a celebration. Bright lights, polished suits, handshakes, a commissioner reading names like he's unlocking destinies. But for Antoine Walker, draft night wasn't just a ceremony, it was a pressure valve exploding. One moment he's a star in a powerful college program, the next he's a financial asset with a price tag, a projection, and a whole ecosystem orbiting around what he might become. And that's the first trap. The moment Antoine Walker hears his name and steps into the NBA world, the money doesn't just represent opportunity, it represents obligation. People think a rookie contract means freedom. In reality, it can feel like a new kind of captivity. Suddenly everyone has a plan for you. agents, advisors, friends from back home, new friends you didn't even know you had. Everybody has a smart idea. Everybody knows the right move. Everybody knows what you should buy, where you should live, who you should hire, what you should invest in, how you should set up your family forever. But Antoine Walker is still Antoine Walker, still young, still fueled by confidence, still wired for bold moves. And boldness is rewarded in basketball. In finance, boldness without guardrails becomes a slow-motion disaster. Here's what's easy to miss. When that first real NBA money arrives, it rarely arrives into a calm and disciplined life. It arrives into chaos, a schedule that never stops, constant travel, interviews, spotlight, expectations. On top of that, there's a psychological shift that hits hard. Antoine Walker is no longer just proving he can play. Now he's proving he belongs. He has to look like an NBA player, live like an NBA player, spend like an NBA player. Because in that culture, presentation is treated like truth. And once you start spending for presentation, you don't notice how quickly the baseline moves. A normal apartment becomes too small. A regular car becomes not the image. A quiet life becomes not the lifestyle. Then it becomes, I deserve it. And that phrase can justify almost anything. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. People see headlines like over 100 million earned, and they assume it's a straight line from paycheck to bank account. But Antoine Walker is stepping into a world where money leaks in multiple directions at once. Taxes, fees, support for family, support for friends, business managers, purchases that lose value the second you sign the paperwork, and long-term commitments that don't care whether your role in the league changes. And the most dangerous part is psychological. Early success can convince a player that the future is guaranteed. You start thinking in seasons, not decades. You start treating your career like an endless runway, not a window that can close faster than anyone wants to admit. So draft night isn't just the beginning of Antoine Walker's professional career. It's the beginning of a new identity and a new set of temptations. The NBA doesn't just give you a platform, it gives you a mirror. And every time Antoine Walker looked into that mirror, the question wasn't only, how good am I? It was, how big can I live? And if your answer is always bigger, you don't fall all at once. You climb, and then you realize you built the ladder out of promises. Because once Antoine Walker stepped into Boston, the city didn't just want a player. Boston wanted a symbol. And symbols are expensive. Boston is not a city that quietly watches basketball. Boston debates basketball. Boston interrogates basketball. Boston turns every possession into an argument, every slump into a scandal, every hot streak into a prophecy. So when Antoine Walker arrived, he didn't enter a calm market. He entered a courtroom, and the jury was always in session. From the start, Antoine Walker wasn't just another young guy. He was treated like a cornerstone, a visible face of a proud franchise trying to claw its way back toward relevance. That kind of role doesn't only shape your minutes and your shot attempts, it shapes your personality. You begin to carry yourself like the story revolves around you because for a while, it does. On the court, Antoine Walker's confidence wasn't subtle. He played with a willingness to take big shots, to own big moments, to behave like the game belonged to him. Fans love that when it works. Critics weaponize it when it doesn't. And in Boston, that swing is violent. One night, you're the future. Next night, you're the problem. So what does a young star do in a city like that? He doubles down on identity. If you're going to be judged either way, you might as well be unforgettable. And Antoine Walker was unforgettable, not only because of his style, but because he leaned into being larger than life. Now, connect that to money. Stardom doesn't just increase your income. It increases your sense of entitlement to a certain lifestyle. Your world gets filled with signals that you've made it. You're recognized. You're covered on TV. You're treated differently in restaurants. People offer things. People want access. And access in that world often comes with a price that doesn't show up on the receipt. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Antoine Walker's spending doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens inside a culture that rewards display. The same boldness that fuels a heat check jumper can fuel a heat check purchase. And the line between celebrating success and building a financial trap is thinner than most people realize. There's also the pressure of being a provider. A lot of stars, especially those who carry the hopes of communities back home, feel a deep responsibility to help. But help can become a machine. One request becomes 10. One favor becomes an expectation. And when you're young, famous, and surrounded by people who applaud your generosity, saying no feels like betrayal. So Antoine Walker becomes the main character in Boston. And with that comes a hidden cost, maintaining the main character lifestyle. Not just the nice things, but the sense of being the one who pays, the one who hosts, the one who proves his success in public. And while the fans were judging his shot selection, something else was quietly taking shape behind the scenes, a financial structure that depended on the idea that the money would always be there. That's what makes the story chilling. Because Antoine Walker wasn't losing money because he hated money, he was losing money because he was trying to live up to what fame told him he should be. And then the pressure intensified, because Boston didn't just watch Antoine Walker. Boston demanded that Antoine Walker become a savior. There's a specific kind of stress that comes with being a star in Boston. It's not just that people care, it's that people remember. They remember legends. They remember banners. They measure you against ghosts. And if you're not built for that comparison, it can twist you. For Antoine Walker, the pressure wasn't only about wins and losses. It was about identity. Was he a franchise leader or a volume scorer? Was he a winner in the making or a talented distraction? In Boston, those questions aren't asked politely. They're thrown like accusations. And when you're the one being accused, you don't just respond on the court, you respond with your whole life. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Antoine Walker by nature was a performer, confident, expressive, willing to be seen. That can be powerful. It can also become a cage because once you're performing, you're always on. And when you're always on, you start spending like a person who can't afford to look normal. Think about how that works day to day. If you have a bad game, you don't just hear boos. You hear questions. You hear talk shows. You hear jokes. You hear doubts from people who never met you but feel entitled to decide who you are, and that constant noise creates a hunger for control. You want something you can command. On the court, you control the ball. Off the court, many players try to control the story with image. And image often gets built with money. So the pressure doesn't only push Antoine Walker to take more responsibility in games, it pushes him to live like someone who's untouchable, to look successful in a way that silences critics, even if only for a night, to be seen in the right places, with the right people, in the right environment. Because in a media storm, being ordinary feels like losing. Then there's the social pressure that fans rarely see, the constant stream of people wanting something, advice requests, business proposals, once-in-a-lifetime deals, emotional appeals, people who speak to you like they were there before the fame, even if they weren't. People who create urgency. Do it now. This opportunity won't last. We can't miss this. Urgency is a financial predator. It makes smart people do rushed things. It makes young people sign agreements they barely read. It makes you trust charisma over competence. And when you combine urgency with a star's confidence, the same confidence that says, "I'll figure it out," you get a recipe for quiet disaster. Here's the cruel irony. The more pressure Antoine Walker felt to prove himself, the more likely he was to make decisions that felt like power in the moment and became weakness later. Because if you spend to protect your identity, you don't feel like you're wasting money. You feel like you're buying security. You feel like you're buying respect. You feel like you're buying silence. But the bills don't care about respect. And Boston, with all its intensity, was only the beginning. Because the next chapters take Antoine Walker into higher stakes, bigger expectations, and the kind of turning point that can change a career and a bank account in one phone call. In Boston, belief is a currency, not the soft kind you find in motivational speeches, the hard kind that shows up in ticket sales, talk radio, and a city's mood on a Monday morning. And for a stretch, Antoine Walker and Paul Pierce didn't just win games. They sold belief back to a franchise that was starving for it. This partnership mattered because it wasn't built on quiet efficiency. It was built on personality, on swagger, on the idea that the Celtics had two young stars who could stare down anybody. Antoine Walker brought volume and fearlessness, the kind of confidence that makes a player take shots other guys won't even consider. Paul Pierce brought a colder kind of danger, patience, footwork, the ability to score without needing chaos. Together, they created a storyline Boston couldn't resist. Two young leaders, two distinct styles, one shared mission, dragged the Celtics back into the spotlight. But partnerships like this come with hidden pressure, especially for the louder personality. When Paul Pierce's game looks calm and controlled, and Antoine Walker's game looks bold and explosive, the public starts narrating their differences like it's a moral debate. One is reliable, one is reckless. One is the future, one is a question mark. And every time that narrative got louder, Antoine Walker had to fight it, not only with wins, but with presence. That matters because presence has a cost. Antoine Walker wasn't just trying to be great. Antoine Walker was trying to be undeniable. In a city that analyzes every decision, the temptation is to go bigger, bigger plays, bigger statements, bigger image. And when you're a star in a market like Boston, you start to learn that you're not just paid to perform, you're paid to represent. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Better travel, better restaurants, better everything. And as your lifestyle grows, your financial commitments grow with it, quietly, relentlessly, until your baseline becomes something you can't maintain without constant top-tier income. And here's the part that would look strange to a normal person. The higher you climb, the more people attach themselves to you as if you are a public resource. When Antoine Walker and Paul Pierce were winning, everyone wanted in. Everyone wanted to celebrate. Everyone wanted proximity to that energy, and a lot of that celebration lands on the star's wallet, because that's how the culture works. You pay because you can. You pay because you're expected to. You pay because saying no makes you look small, and no star wants to look small. On the court, the partnership delivered moments that made the city electric. You could feel it in the way the Garden reacted, in the way the media changed tone, in the way fans started talking about the Celtics like the story wasn't over. Antoine Walker wasn't just putting up numbers. Antoine Walker was part of a revival narrative. But revival narratives are addictive. They make you feel like you're always one step away from the next level. And that feeling can push you toward risk. Because if you believe the future is guaranteed, you make decisions like it's guaranteed. And the Celtics, with Antoine Walker and Paul Pierce leading the charge, were about to reach the kind of peak that makes a young star think, I'm set for life. That's when the cliff becomes hardest to see. There are seasons that define a player, not because they end with a trophy, but because they end with almost. And almost can haunt you. It can also fuel you into decisions that look brave and turn out fatal. For Antoine Walker, this was the era when Boston's hopes sharpened. The team wasn't just trying to be respectable anymore, it was trying to matter. Every big game felt like a referendum on whether Antoine Walker was truly a franchise leader. Every playoff series felt like the league watching him take a test. And the atmosphere around that kind of run is intoxicating. The arena louder, the interviews more intense, the coverage more constant. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. When the stakes rise, athletes don't only feel stress, they feel a surge of meaning. Everything becomes dramatic. Every win feels like destiny. Every loss feels like humiliation. And if you're Antoine Walker, a player who thrives on confidence and rhythm, the emotional swings can become part of your lifestyle. High adrenaline nights followed by the need to come down. Big wins followed by celebration. Tough losses followed by the need to drown out the noise. And that cycle is where spending starts to become a coping tool. Because the truth is, money is one of the few levers a young star can pull instantly. You can't instantly fix criticism. You can't instantly fix a bad shooting night. You can't instantly control what the media says. But you can instantly change your environment. You can go somewhere exclusive. You can buy something that signals power. You can surround yourself with people who tell you you're still the man. That's why almost seasons are dangerous. They inflate the sense that you're right on the edge of permanent greatness. And that makes it easy to justify permanent expenses. You start thinking your life should already match the future you're about to have, so you spend like the future is already in the bank. The Celtics' playoff moments, the big nights, the attention, it all feeds the illusion that Antoine Walker's prime will last forever. And if you're surrounded by people who benefit from your spending, nobody is going to be the one who says, "Slow down." They'll say the opposite. "You earned this. You deserve this. This is what stars do." Even the best advice can get drowned out by that chorus. And when you're young, success can make you resistant to caution. You start to think caution is for people who don't believe in themselves. That's the trap. Confidence, when it becomes arrogance toward reality, is a silent enemy. So while the Celtics were fighting for the next step, while Antoine Walker and Paul Pierce were trying to break through, another battle was quietly starting. The battle between Antoine Walker's lifestyle and the reality that NBA careers, even great ones, can shift fast. And the moment the league begins shifting around you, your financial structure gets tested like a fragile bridge in a storm. And that storm was coming. A trade is a transaction on paper. A player goes here, a player goes there, assets move, the league keeps rolling. Fans argue about it like it's fantasy sports. But for the player living it, a trade can feel like an identity being ripped away. For Antoine Walker, leaving Boston wasn't just moving cities, it was losing a narrative he had built for himself. He had been the centerpiece of a comeback story. He had been the loud personality on a proud franchise. He had been the name that drew reactions. And then, suddenly, the message is clear. The team is moving forward without you. Even if a player understands it logically, emotionally, it lands like rejection. And rejection triggers a specific kind of response in high achievers. Proving you're still elite. Proving you didn't need them. Proving the critics wrong. Proving the city wrong. Proving is expensive. Because when Antoine Walker was traded, he didn't just lose a uniform, he lost stability. He lost the routine of being the guy in one place. He lost familiar staff, familiar teammates, familiar media. And that kind of shakeup can push a player toward impulsive choices. You're trying to regain control, to regain status, to regain the feeling of being anchored. This is also where the new circle problem begins. Every move creates a new set of people around you, new managers, new friends, new opportunities, new temptations. And for someone already living big, relocation can become a financial earthquake. New house, new cars, new spending patterns, new expectations from a new environment that wants to see you show up like a star immediately. And you know what's worst? Pride. Pride makes you refuse to downshift. Pride makes you keep paying for the same lifestyle even when the career situation is changing. Pride makes you believe that adjusting your spending would look like admitting weakness. So Antoine Walker enters the next phase of his career with something heavy on his shoulders. The need to reassert his identity. The need to show the league he is still the same Antoine Walker, still confident, still bold, still worth the spotlight. But the league is ruthless, and the financial world is even more ruthless. Because the moment your role starts changing, fewer touches, fewer headlines, less control. The income might still be high, but the sense of permanence starts to crack. And when a star's permanence cracks, the debts don't care, the bills don't care, the obligations don't care. That's why the trade out of Boston wasn't only a basketball turning point, it was the moment Antoine Walker's entire life started relying on the most dangerous assumption in sports, that tomorrow will always pay for today. And now, with a new city waiting, Antoine Walker was about to learn what it means to chase stability by running faster. When Antoine Walker landed in Dallas, the move looked clean on the surface. New team, new system, new opportunity to prove that Boston didn't define him. And in the NBA, a fresh start can feel like oxygen. Different coaches, different media, different expectations. Sometimes that's all a player needs to reset the story. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A fresh start can also be the perfect hiding place. Because if Antoine Walker's life had already started drifting off balance, financially, emotionally, socially, a new city doesn't fix the drift. It just changes the scenery, while the same habits keep running in the background. Dallas wasn't built around Antoine Walker the way Boston had been. That shift matters more than fans realize. In Boston, Antoine Walker's identity was anchored to being the loud centerpiece, the big personality, the man with the weight of a franchise on his shoulders. In Dallas, he was entering a different ecosystem, one where he needed to adapt quickly, find his place, and earn trust in a new hierarchy. And if you've ever watched someone who's used to being the guy try to adjust to being one of the guys, you know it can get messy. The instinct is to overcompensate, to talk bigger, to spend bigger, to show everyone you're still a star, even if your role is shifting. That's the hidden financial trap of a trade. Your lifestyle is usually built for the version of you that existed before the move, the franchise face version, the every commercial wants me version, the I'm here for the next decade version. But when you're relocated, reality becomes more fragile, and your expenses often don't adjust. They expand. New home, new routines, new people expecting you to play the part of the high-earning celebrity instantly, and Antoine Walker had spent years learning how to play that part. Dallas also introduces the new circle effect, the fresh wave of contacts who suddenly appear with smiles and ideas. Some are harmless, some are opportunists, and the dangerous ones don't announce themselves. They don't show up looking shady. They show up polished, confident, and connected. They speak the language of business. They offer shortcuts. They promise returns. They promise protection. They promise they can handle things so Antoine Walker can focus on basketball. That's exactly how athletes get trapped. Not by one obvious villain, but by a network of small decisions where the player signs off because he's busy, trusting, and convinced his income will cover any mistakes. And remember Antoine Walker's mindset: bold, confident, fast-moving. That's the kind of personality that can thrive on the court and get punished off it. Because in finance, speed and confidence are not enough. You need patience. You need boring discipline. You need the ability to say not yet and no and show me the details. But players in the middle of a season don't want more friction. They want less. So Dallas becomes a proving ground, not just for Antoine Walker's game, but for his stability. Can Antoine Walker reinvent himself without chasing the same image? Can Antoine Walker accept a new role without trying to buy the old one back? Can Antoine Walker slow down long enough to see what's happening around him? And even if his paycheck still looks massive, the deeper problem is starting to form. Antoine Walker's financial life is turning into a machine with too many moving parts, too many commitments, too many people with their hands in the system, too much maintenance required just to keep the illusion intact. Because when you've built your identity on living big, a new team doesn't just test your basketball. It tests whether you can live like the future isn't guaranteed. And in the next stop, Antoine Walker will discover that instability doesn't always arrive as a crisis. Sometimes it arrives as convenience. Atlanta should have felt like a reset button for Antoine Walker, a new market, different expectations, and enough distance from Boston's constant spotlight to breathe. But sometimes distance doesn't bring peace. Sometimes it brings quiet. And quiet can be dangerous when your life is already running on momentum. In Atlanta, the story of Antoine Walker becomes more complicated. This isn't the clean rise anymore. This is the middle chapter where reality starts pressing in from all directions. Antoine Walker is still a recognizable name. Antoine Walker still has pride. Antoine Walker still has the instincts of a star. But the league changes fast, and the league doesn't pause for nostalgia. Here's what makes this phase crucial. When a player's role begins to shift, even slightly, the mental pressure often gets worse, not better. Because you're not fighting for fame anymore. You're fighting for identity. You're fighting for the version of yourself that the world already knows. And that fight can turn into reckless behavior without looking reckless. It can look like staying confident. It can look like living like a winner. It can look like I'm still Antoine Walker. But inside, there's anxiety. The fear that if you slow down, the world will move on without you. So what does that anxiety do? It pushes you toward quick relief. It pushes you toward environments where people hype you up. It pushes you toward spending that makes you feel powerful again. Because money can buy a moment of certainty. Not real certainty, just the feeling of it. Atlanta is also where the deal culture can become a trap. When you're famous, people don't pitch you normal ideas. They pitch you big ideas. They pitch you once-in-a-lifetime investments. They pitch you partnerships. They pitch you businesses. And they love using your name because your name opens doors. For Antoine Walker, that kind of attention can feel like validation. If people want you involved, it means you still matter. But business proposals often do something sneaky. They turn the athlete into the product. Your reputation becomes collateral. Your signature becomes value. And if the structure is bad, you don't just lose money, you lose control. And here's where we build the story carefully. Antoine Walker's eventual financial collapse wasn't simply about buying expensive things. It was also about money bleeding away through smart-sounding commitments that weren't truly controlled. That's the reality for many high earners. You don't have to be careless to get crushed. You just have to be busy, trusting, and surrounded by people who benefit when you say yes. In Atlanta, Antoine Walker is trying to keep the story alive. But the deeper narrative is turning. The lifestyle is now heavier than the career. The obligations are now bigger than the daily reality. And when that happens, every choice becomes a kind of gamble, because you're constantly betting that the next contract, the next season, the next opportunity will cover what you're committing to right now. And the scariest part? From the outside, nobody sees the stress. They see cars, they see jewelry, they see photos, they see a public image that says he's fine. That's why financial collapse shocks people. It doesn't look like a collapse while it's happening. It looks like success, right up until the moment it doesn't. So Atlanta doesn't save Antoine Walker. It reveals something. It reveals that the foundation under his life isn't as solid as the public believes. It reveals that the pressure isn't only on the court. It's in his calendar, in his circle, in the constant need to keep the machine running. And then comes the twist that feels like destiny. Antoine Walker returns to Boston, the city that made him, hoping the old magic will fix what the present has broken. But nostalgia doesn't pay bills. Returning to Boston sounds like a movie moment, the familiar crowd, the old arena energy, the idea that you can walk back into the place where you became a star and reclaim the version of yourself the world loved. For Antoine Walker, coming back wasn't just a basketball decision, it was emotional. Because Boston wasn't only a team to him, Boston was an identity. It was where Antoine Walker became Antoine Walker to the national audience. The swagger, the big shots, the debates, the noise, the feeling that every night mattered. Returning offered a powerful illusion. Maybe the story can rewind. Maybe the mistakes can be erased by one more run. Maybe the confidence can come back as easily as the jersey. And that illusion is seductive for a person under pressure. When life is unstable, the mind reaches for something familiar. It reaches for old routines, old places, old people. It tells you, if you go back, you'll feel normal again. But for athletes, the problem is simple. You can return to a city, but you can't return to time. The league changes, bodies change, roles change, expectations shift. And the version of Antoine Walker that Boston once worshipped isn't the version Boston is asking for now. That creates a tension the audience can feel, and it creates a tension Antoine Walker has to live with. When fans see a comeback, they don't see the complicated reality. They see a promise. They see a highlight reel. They see the old swagger and expect it to reappear on command. But the comeback phase is often where a player's internal stress spikes, because you're trying to meet expectations that were built in a different era. You're trying to live up to a memory. And memories are unfair opponents. They don't get tired, they don't miss shots, they don't deal with fatigue. Now connect that to money. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. You want to look like you never fell. You want to look like you're still at the top. You want to look like the headlines can't touch you. So you keep the lifestyle consistent, sometimes even more aggressive, because downshifting feels like admitting the critics were right. And while Antoine Walker is fighting for a basketball role, the real danger is off court. The financial commitments don't care about nostalgia. The payments don't stop because the crowd cheers. The obligations don't pause because you're back home. If anything, a comeback can create more pressure to spend, more celebrations, more people showing up, more requests, more emotional spending disguised as, I'm taking care of everyone. Boston also brings back the old noise, talk radio, columnists, fans who feel ownership over your story. And when that noise gets loud, some players react by becoming more guarded. Others react by becoming more performative. Antoine Walker's personality was never built for hiding. Antoine Walker fought criticism by being even more visible. But visibility is expensive when it's used as armor. It's about a man trying to negotiate with his own past. Antoine Walker wants the city to see him as a hero again. Antoine Walker wants the league to treat him like he still belongs at the center of the stage. Antoine Walker wants the familiar environment to restore control. Yet the truth is, the comeback doesn't fix the deeper problem. It doesn't rebuild the financial foundation. It doesn't erase the accumulation of bad commitments. It doesn't remove the people who benefited from Antoine Walker saying yes too often. And that's why the next phase hits even harder. Because after the nostalgia, Antoine Walker walks into a place that amplifies temptation, amplifies lifestyle, and amplifies risk. A place where winning feels like permission, and where the dark side of fame is waiting, dressed like celebration. When Antoine Walker arrived in Miami, it wasn't just another stop on a veteran's map. Miami is a mood. Miami is a stage. Miami is the kind of place where a professional athlete can feel like the world is constantly applauding, even on a random Tuesday night. And for Antoine Walker, a man whose identity was built on being seen, being bold, being larger than life, that environment didn't simply fit him, it amplified him. From the outside, this looks like the perfect setup, a fresh system, a serious organization, a roster with real ambition. But the hidden story is what Miami does to a player's psychology, because Miami can make a man feel like he's living inside a highlight reel. The restaurants, the clubs, the VIP culture, the constant sense that this is what winners look like. It creates a loop. And once you're in that loop, spending stops feeling like spending. It starts feeling like you're maintaining the identity the world expects. And that's when the picture started to crack. It's emotional. You can't understand his financial collapse without understanding the way fame behaves in certain cities. In Miami, fame isn't quiet. Fame is interactive. Fame is a currency you can spend in real time. And the people around a famous player often treat that fame like it belongs to the room, like it's a party favor everyone gets to enjoy. So what happens? The circle expands, the hangouts get bigger, the expectations get louder, the requests get smoother. Suddenly, there are more friends to host, more celebrations to fund, more moments where Antoine Walker is expected to be the generous star who picks up the check because that's what stars do. And every time he does, it feels like loyalty, it feels like leadership, it feels like he's proving he's still the man. But the problem with proving is that it never ends. You don't prove once, you prove every night. And when your life is built around the idea that you must always look successful, you begin spending in ways that ignore long-term reality. Miami also introduces a different kind of pressure, winning pressure. When you're around a team that has a real title mission, every game matters, every role is scrutinized, and every player is expected to be ready. That pressure can push athletes into a specific coping pattern. They seek high-intensity relief off the court to balance the high-intensity demands on the court. It's not always obvious. It can be as simple as chasing constant stimulation because quiet feels like stress. And there's another layer people forget. When you're traveling all the time, when you're constantly surrounded by attention, you rarely sit down and truly look at your financial picture. You outsource, you delegate, you trust, you assume it's handled, and the more money you earn, the easier it becomes to believe that even if something is slightly wrong, it can be fixed later. That belief is dangerous, because later is a fantasy when obligations are piling up in real time. The bills don't wait, the commitments don't pause, the lifestyle doesn't politely shrink just because your role shifts or your next contract isn't as big. In Miami, Antoine Walker is stepping into a chapter that looks glamorous, but functions like a magnifying glass. Every impulse gets bigger, every celebration gets bigger, every risky habit has more room to grow. And the most seductive part is that it doesn't feel like danger, it feels like reward. It feels like Antoine Walker finally landed in a place where the culture matches his personality. But a culture that matches your personality can also feed your weakest instincts. And once Miami starts giving Antoine Walker that constant high, the next step becomes inevitable. The moment where the world sees him at the top, and he starts believing the top will last forever. A championship run changes the way the world talks about you. Before, you're a talented player with questions around you. After, you're a winner. And winners carry a special kind of protection in sports culture, the kind that makes people stop arguing and start saluting. For Antoine Walker, that ring wasn't just jewelry, it was a stamp. It told every critic, every radio host, every fan who ever rolled their eyes at his style, say what you want, but he reached the summit. He became an NBA champion. And that kind of achievement can bring a rush so powerful it rewires how a person thinks about risk. Because the second you win, you don't only feel joy, you feel permission. Permission to celebrate bigger, permission to live louder, permission to stop worrying, permission to believe the story is now guaranteed to have a happy ending. The confetti falls, the cameras flash, the city celebrates, and deep down, a voice starts whispering, "You made it. You're safe." But the sports world is cruel because it sells safety while giving none. Here's the key psychological shift. When Antoine Walker wins a title, he doesn't just view it as one season's success. He can start viewing it as proof that his instincts are always right, that his boldness is a superpower, that when he takes risks, the universe rewards him. On the court, boldness can be a weapon. Off the court, boldness without limits becomes a financial trap. And that trap often opens right after the peak, not during the struggle. During the struggle, players are focused, they're disciplined, they're grinding. During the struggle, there's less time for excess, but after the title, after the parade energy, after the champagne photos and the "we did it" moment, that's when the lifestyle can explode. Because now Antoine Walker isn't just rich. Antoine Walker is rich and validated. That combination is dangerous. When you're validated, caution can feel unnecessary. People congratulating you rarely say, "Great job, now tighten your budget." They say, "You deserve everything." They say, "Live it up." They say, "This is your moment." And Antoine Walker, like many athletes, was living inside a culture where your moment is treated like it might vanish tomorrow. That belief drives spending. It drives urgency. It drives the impulse to turn success into purchases, experiences, and visible symbols. Because in a career where everything can change quickly, you start trying to capture the feeling while you can. The championship also changes the kind of people who approach you. It increases your market value in ways that have nothing to do with basketball. Suddenly, you're not just a player. You're a brand. You're an investor target. You're a celebrity opportunity. The invitations multiply. The proposals look bigger. The numbers get larger. And if you already have a habit of trusting the wrong voices, a championship makes those voices sound even more confident. Because now they can say, "You're a champion. This is what champions do. Think big." That's how a reckless idea becomes a vision. That's how an overpriced commitment becomes a smart move. That's how a bad deal gets dressed up as destiny. So while the world is celebrating Antoine Walker at his peak, there's a quieter story unfolding. The foundation under the lifestyle is not being reinforced. It's being stretched. And stretched foundations don't break instantly. They crack slowly in ways no camera captures, which is why the most dangerous period of Antoine Walker's life didn't begin when he was struggling. It began when he was winning. The public thinks the fall begins with a scandal or a sudden collapse, but in many real stories, the fall begins in comfort. It begins in the sweet period after success, when the pressure eases, the applause gets louder, and the urgency to protect yourself gets replaced by the temptation to indulge yourself. For Antoine Walker, the ring changed the emotional temperature of his life. It offered relief from years of scrutiny. It offered closure to old debates. It offered a sense of arrival. And arrival can do something sneaky. It makes you stop preparing for change. Because when you feel like you've arrived, you build your life as if you'll remain exactly where you are. That's a mistake in the NBA, where roles shift, bodies change, coaches change, front offices change, and the league's attention moves on like a spotlight searching for its next target. But a lifestyle built during arrival is usually heavy. It's built on the assumption of permanent top-tier income. It's built on the expectation that the checks will keep matching the image. And here's where Antoine Walker's story becomes painfully relatable in a strange way. Even when you have money, anxiety doesn't vanish. It changes shape. A star can start worrying not about making it, but about keeping it, keeping relevance, keeping respect, keeping the lifestyle, keeping the circle happy. So instead of slowing down after winning, some athletes speed up. They chase more stimulation, more proof, more excitement. They keep spending because spending is part of the identity. It's part of the story they tell themselves, "I'm still that guy, I'm still on top." But on top is a feeling, not a contract. And the cruel part is that the signs of trouble can look like normal celebrity life. Buying another property can look like wealth building. Hosting another big night can look like generosity. Signing onto another business project can look like ambition. In reality, those things can be leaks, slow leaks, that drain a fortune while the world still assumes you're fine. This is also when long-term commitments become the real enemy. A one-time splurge hurts less than recurring obligations. Houses come with maintenance, staff, taxes, insurance. A large circle comes with constant expectations. Helping becomes a monthly responsibility, not a one-time gesture. And when those obligations pile up, they create a life that requires a certain level of income just to stay afloat. Now add the human factor. People who benefit from your spending rarely encourage you to cut back. If Antoine Walker's lifestyle supported others, directly or indirectly, then the system around him had every incentive to keep the spending rolling. Doubt, moments where the numbers felt doubt, moments where the numbers felt heavy, moments where the stress whispered that something was off. He could still be surrounded by voices telling him, everything is normal, everything is fine, everything is under control. And that's the moment where the trap becomes almost impossible to escape, because you don't feel like you're in a trap. You feel like you're living the life you earned. But then reality begins to tap the glass. The role shifts. The minutes change. The contracts don't feel as permanent. The league moves forward. And when that happens, the question becomes brutal. If Antoine Walker's lifestyle was built for the top, what happens when the top starts slipping? Because the next chapters are where the story turns from expensive habits into something far more serious. The part where the league's doors start closing, the financial pressure spikes, and the private damage starts becoming public. By the time Antoine Walker reached the Minnesota chapter of his NBA life, the story had shifted in a way most fans don't notice until it's too late. It wasn't the loud fall yet. It was the quieter, colder phase, the league beginning to move on, not with an announcement, not with a dramatic statement, but with subtle signals that are brutal if you're the one receiving them. Minutes aren't the same. Touches aren't the same. The margin for error shrinks. Younger players get chances you used to get automatically. Coaches treat you differently. Front offices start talking about fit and flexibility in ways that sound polite, but mean one thing: we're not building around you. For Antoine Walker, that kind of shift is not just professional, it's personal. Because Antoine Walker's identity was built on being a visible star, a man who could walk into an arena and feel the building react. When that reaction fades, even slightly, it can trigger panic. And panic in a high-earning life doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like denial. Denial is a dangerous emotion for a veteran athlete because it convinces you that the change is temporary, that one good stretch will restore everything, that the next situation will be better, that the league will remember who you are, and maybe, in basketball terms, that belief is necessary just to keep playing. But in financial terms, denial is poison. Because the moment your career begins to shift downward, your lifestyle should become more disciplined, not less. Yet many players do the opposite. They keep spending at the same level, sometimes even higher, because spending is tied to self-image. If you reduce your lifestyle, it feels like admitting the decline is real. And Antoine Walker, like any competitor with pride, would naturally resist that admission. Minnesota also represents something else: instability. When a player is bouncing between teams, the entire structure of life becomes expensive. Moving costs, new housing, new routines, new networks of people. You rebuild your environment repeatedly, and every rebuild invites more spending, more commitments, more temporary solutions that turn permanent. And there's an emotional component here that rarely gets discussed. Late career life can feel lonely. Not because you're literally alone, but because you're surrounded by change. New teammates, new staff, new cities. You don't have the same anchors you had as a franchise cornerstone. That can push a person toward the kinds of environments that feel familiar: crowds, nightlife, constant movement, a circle that makes you feel important again. And yes, that often costs money. Here's the cruelest part of the late career slide. To the public, Antoine Walker still looks rich. He's still an NBA name. He's still recognized. He still has the aura of his peak. That's what makes financial collapse so shocking. Because the outside image stays polished longer than the internal reality. And once the image becomes a mask, the player starts spending not for enjoyment, but for maintenance. Maintaining the idea that nothing has changed. Maintaining the sense that Antoine Walker is still living at the top, even as the foundation underneath is shifting. So Minnesota is not just a team stop. Minnesota is the stage where the underlying math begins to turn hostile. Because late career money is not the same as early career money, the future checks become less predictable. The long-term security becomes more fragile, And if you've built your life around an assumption of permanent peak income, fragility becomes a threat. This is the point in the story where Antoine Walker's finances stop being a problem and start becoming a ticking clock. And the clock doesn't care how famous you were, it only cares what you owe and how fast the income is changing. When people hear that Antoine Walker earned over $100 million, they react the same way almost every time: disbelief. How can anyone burn through that? How can a person live so wildly that even that kind of money disappears? But that reaction comes from a misunderstanding that is everywhere in sports culture, confusing earnings with wealth. Earnings are what comes in, wealth is what stays. And the gap between those two numbers can become a canyon if your life is built on the wrong assumptions. The numbers can look huge, but the drain can be even bigger. When Antoine Walker signs big contracts, the public imagines a clean pipeline, money goes into the bank, and the player becomes permanently safe. Reality is more complex. Money gets divided immediately. Taxes, agent fees, union dues, management fees, lifestyle costs. Was disciplined, and many people assume was disciplined, and many people assume he wasn't. The system around a star can still be expensive. And if Antoine Walker was not disciplined, the system becomes a furnace. The more you earn, the more opportunities there are to make large mistakes. Here's the deeper issue. Athletes often experience money in waves. Big checks arrive, then time passes, then another big check arrives. That rhythm can create a psychological mistake. You start living as if the next wave is guaranteed. You start committing to expenses that require the next wave. And once your expenses are built around future income, your life becomes a bet. A bet on health, a bet on performance, a bet on staying in the league, a bet on good advice, a bet on the people around you, a bet that nothing goes wrong. That's why the over 100 million number can be misleading. It makes people think Antoine Walker had endless money. But if Antoine Walker had recurring obligations, big obligations, his life could require an enormous amount of cash flow just to stay stable. And if those obligations were paired with risky decisions like bad investments or expensive habits, the drain accelerates. There's also a cultural factor. In certain circles, generosity isn't optional, it's expected. When you become the success story, people treat you like a bridge out of their own problems. They ask for help, they ask for opportunities, they ask for money. And if you're the kind of person who wants to be loyal, who wants to prove you didn't forget where you came from, the request can become constant. So the money isn't just leaving through cars and houses, it's leaving through social pressure, through emotional commitments, through a star's desire to be respected and loved. And if Antoine Walker didn't have strict boundaries, if Antoine Walker felt responsible for everyone, then even huge earnings could turn into a fast-moving drain. Now add the final ingredient, confidence. Antoine Walker's confidence was part of his greatness. But confidence can also create a dangerous belief. I'll always figure it out. That belief can lead you to ignore boring details, contracts, paperwork, fine print, long-term projections. It can lead you to trust the wrong people because they sound sure of themselves. It can lead you to spend now and assume you'll fix it later. But later is not a plan, it's a hope. So the big earnings don't protect Antoine Walker from collapse. In a strange way, they enable it. Because the more money you have, the longer you can ignore the warnings, the longer you can patch holes without changing behavior, the longer you can pretend the foundation is strong, until it isn't. And when it finally breaks, the headlines don't say a series of small errors compounded over time. They say bankruptcy. They say shocking downfall. Which brings us to the moment when Antoine Walker's private financial stress becomes public, not through gossip, not through locker room whispers, but through a courtroom story that suddenly made his situation impossible to hide. There's a difference between rumors and records. Rumors can be shrugged off. Records live forever. And when Antoine Walker's name became linked to a legal dispute involving gambling debt, the story took on a new weight. Because now the issue wasn't just he spends too much. Now it was paperwork. Now it was a public case. Now it was a headline that didn't care about context or excuses. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. When the success starts fading, the same mistakes become visible. Reports described Antoine Walker owing significant money related to casino markers, and in 2009, public reports said those markers added up to close to $1 million, a type of credit arrangement that can feel deceptively casual to a VIP. The atmosphere of a casino is designed to make money feel less real. Lights, music, luxury, attention, staff, treating you like royalty. The entire experience is engineered to lower your defenses. And if you're already living in a mindset of big numbers, it can become easy to treat debt like a temporary inconvenience instead of a structural threat. This isn't about demonizing Antoine Walker, this is about understanding the mechanism. A professional athlete often lives in a world where people say yes to him constantly. The athlete is catered to. The athlete is protected from friction. And in that environment, risk can start feeling normal. You can start believing consequences are negotiable, because in so many parts of celebrity life, they are. But legal disputes don't negotiate with reputation. They negotiate with documents. When the debt story surfaced, it did more than embarrass Antoine Walker. It changed how people saw him. It added a shadow to his public identity. It gave critics a new weapon. It made old narratives louder, irresponsible, reckless, out of control. And that kind of public judgment can create a feedback loop. Stress increases, pressure increases, the need to escape increases. And for someone vulnerable to risky environments, increased stress can push them back toward the very habits that created the problem. And that's why this moment mattered. It's not just a scandal beat, it's a turning point where the outside world gets a glimpse of what was already happening behind the scenes. Antoine Walker's financial situation wasn't simply expensive, it was fragile. Because large debt isn't only a number, it's a signal that decisions are being made under pressure. It's a sign that cash flow is tighter than the image suggests. It's a clue that the lifestyle is no longer comfortably supported by the career. And once the story becomes public, it does something else. It attracts even more opportunists. People who want to profit off the crisis. People who offer solutions. People who claim they can clean it up, fix it fast, protect the image for a fee. That is exactly when a vulnerable person can get pulled into worse deals, worse choices, worse traps. It's about exposure. It's about the moment Antoine Walker's financial world stops being private. It's about the first time the public can see the cracks. And once cracks are visible, the collapse becomes a countdown. Because the next chapter is where the word everyone thinks is impossible finally becomes real, bankruptcy, and the story shifts from how did this happen to who was around him when it did. There's a moment in every rise and fall story when the drama stops being emotional and starts being official. For Antoine Walker, that moment arrived when the word bankruptcy entered the public record, not as a rumor, not as a sports radio punchline, but as a formal declaration that the financial machine powering his lifestyle had finally collapsed under its own weight. What makes bankruptcy so shocking in the case of Antoine Walker isn't only the amount of money people believe he earned, it's the symbolism. Bankruptcy is the moment the image loses its power. It's the moment the story can't be spun with charisma or smoothed over with confident talk or temporarily patched with another flashy purchase. Bankruptcy is the moment reality becomes a document. And once reality becomes a document, the world reads you differently. For years, Antoine Walker's public identity was built on high-energy confidence. The bold shot-taker, the visible personality, the champion, the man who lived like the spotlight, was permanent. Even after trades, even after shifting roles, the public still tends to see an NBA name and assume the financial side is secure. That assumption is powerful because it allows the athlete to keep the illusion alive. The lifestyle continues, the appearances continue, the circle continues. And as long as the illusion holds, people keep treating you as if you're untouchable. But a filing is the opposite of untouchable. It's exposure. Reports around Antoine Walker's financial collapse pointed to a gap that felt almost unbelievable. Assets that did not match obligations, a structure that could no longer sustain itself, and a reality where the big number people love to repeat was no longer relevant. Because the public number is about the past, bankruptcy is about the present. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Because once you strip away the headlines, the story becomes a question. What kind of life did Antoine Walker build that required so much money just to keep standing? And how did so many decisions go unchecked long enough for the collapse to become this dramatic? The most uncomfortable answer is that collapse usually looks normal while it's happening. The athlete still shows up. The athlete still has access. The athlete still looks successful. That's why friends, associates, and even some professionals around them can miss the warning signs or choose to ignore them. Because warning signs aren't always visible in public. They're visible in spreadsheets, in credit lines, in monthly obligations, in the quiet reality of what's owed and what's coming in. And athletes like Antoine Walker often don't want to live in spreadsheets. They want to live in performance, in momentum, in the next game, the next season, the next opportunity. That's a survival skill in sports, but it becomes dangerous when your financial structure requires slow, boring discipline. Bankruptcy is also a psychological breaking point. When a person who has been treated like a star for years suddenly faces a public admission of financial failure, the shame can be intense. And shame can make people withdraw, become defensive, lash out, or accept the first solution offered to them without thinking. The danger isn't only losing money, the danger is losing clarity. Because once you're under that kind of public scrutiny, everyone suddenly has an opinion about what you should have done. Some will act sympathetic, others will act cruel, many will act like they're learning a lesson from your pain. But in that moment, Antoine Walker isn't a lesson. He's a human being watching the ground disappear beneath him. And then comes the next twist in this story, the blame game. Because bankruptcy doesn't only make your finances public, it makes your relationships public. It invites questions about advisors, friends, business managers, and deals. It invites critics to pick a villain. It invites defenders to pick an excuse. And it creates competing narratives that fight for dominance, each one trying to explain how a champion can reach a point like this. Which is why the next chapter is where the story becomes even more complex. Because the reason for Antoine Walker's collapse depends on who you believe, what you emphasize, and what you think matters most: lifestyle, investments, or the people in his orbit. When a famous athlete falls financially, the public wants a simple story. The simplest story is the most satisfying. He spent it all on luxury. It fits the stereotype. It feels like common sense. It lets everyone watching feel smarter than the person who fell. But Antoine Walker's situation has always been described as more layered than one lazy punchline. And the truth is, multiple explanations can exist at once. A person can spend too much, invest poorly, trust the wrong people, and underestimate obligations, all in the same life. The collapse doesn't have to be one mistake. It can be a symphony of small mistakes that eventually become too loud to ignore. Three forces collided at once, and each one made the fall steeper. The first narrative, luxury and lifestyle. This is the visible one. It's the homes, the cars, the public image of success that can quietly turn into a financial burden if it's built without a plan. The problem with luxury isn't only the purchase price. It's the ongoing cost. maintenance, taxes, staffing, insurance, and the invisible weight of keeping up when your identity becomes tied to display. For Antoine Walker, whose personality leaned bold and expressive, the temptation to live loudly wasn't just temptation, it was part of how he showed the world he belonged. The second narrative, investments and smart deals that weren't actually smart. This is the less visible, more dangerous one, because it hides behind sophistication. People often assume a player who invests is being responsible. But investments can become traps if they're rushed, poorly vetted, or managed by people whose incentives don't match the athlete's best interests. Athletes are pitched deals constantly: restaurants, real estate, partnerships, ventures that sound impressive. And many of those deals are designed to leverage the athlete's name more than to protect the athlete's finances. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. They make everything sound inevitable. They sell dreams with numbers. They use urgency. And if you're busy, if you're traveling, if you're focused on games, you can start signing off on things that you don't truly control. The third narrative, the inner circle, the people around the athlete. This is the most sensitive and also the most real, because money doesn't disappear by itself. People make decisions, people approve, people advise, people spend, people request, people pressure. And if Antoine Walker felt responsible for supporting an extended group, family, friends, associates, then his finances weren't simply a personal matter. They became a social system, a system where saying no could cost him relationships, respect, and emotional stability. Here's the hard truth. Some circles are loyal, some circles are hungry, most circles are a mix of both. And when you're a star, it can be difficult to tell the difference until the money gets tight. When money is abundant, everyone looks supportive. When money becomes limited, reality reveals itself quickly. So what was the real reason for Antoine Walker? The truth is, it didn't come down to one single mistake. It was a collision between a high-spending lifestyle, imperfect financial management, risky or unsuccessful ventures, and the pressure of maintaining a public image while supporting the expectations of others. And the biggest misconception is that wealth protects you from this collision. In fact, wealth can accelerate it because it allows the bad habits to continue longer before they explode. This is why Antoine Walker's story isn't just an athlete spent money story. It's a story about how fame can turn ordinary mistakes into catastrophic ones, how a champion can become trapped by the very identity he built, how a successful man can wake up one day and realize he wasn't driving the car anymore. He was just sitting in it while everyone else grabbed the wheel. And once that realization hits, the next consequence isn't only financial, it's social. Because bankruptcy doesn't just drain accounts, it drains relationships, it drains status, it drains the oxygen that fame once provided. In professional sports, status is a kind of invisible armor. When you're a star, doors open, people smile, calls get returned, invitations arrive, problems get solved faster. Even strangers treat you like you matter. And the scariest part is that after years of living inside that reality, you can start believing it's normal. For Antoine Walker, fame and status weren't just perks. They were part of the environment he lived in every day. And when the financial collapse became public, it threatened more than his bank balance. It threatened the way the world treated him. Because status is conditional. It's tied to what you can do, what you can provide, and how much power you appear to have. When the world learns that your financial power is damaged, your social power can weaken too. Not instantly, not in one dramatic moment, but through small changes that feel like betrayal. The phone rings less, the invites change, the friends with business proposals become quiet. The people who used to hype you up are suddenly busy. Even the tone of conversation shifts. Some people talk to you like you're fragile, others talk to you like you're a cautionary tale, and some talk to you like you owe them an explanation for how you lived your life. That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Not because they don't have talent anymore, but because they're forced to meet a version of themselves that isn't protected by applause. They have to sit with ordinary reality, paperwork, consequences, public judgment, and they have to rebuild without the instant comfort of being treated like royalty. And rebuilding is not glamorous, it's slow, it's humbling. It requires admitting that some choices were wrong. It requires cutting costs. It requires setting boundaries. It requires saying no and learning who stays when you do. That's why Antoine Walker's loss of status is a major chapter, not a footnote. Because without understanding the emotional cost, people reduce the story to mockery. They act like it's simple. But anyone who has lived under public attention knows the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And when the pedestal disappears, the silence can feel like punishment. Yet this is also where a person can find something rare: clarity. The collapse can strip away the noise. It can reveal which relationships were real. It can force a new discipline. It can create a chance to rebuild on a foundation that isn't built on display. And that leads us to the final phase of the story. What Antoine Walker did afterward, how he tried to reframe the narrative, and what lessons he began sharing publicly. Not as a motivational cliché, but as a warning that came from experience. Because Antoine Walker didn't disappear. Antoine Walker didn't become a ghost story. Antoine Walker, in many ways, became a messenger. But the message only matters if you understand what it cost him to learn it. After the headlines, after the paperwork, after the shock of seeing his name attached to a financial collapse, Antoine Walker entered the hardest phase of all. The phase that doesn't come with a scoreboard. Because rebuilding a life is nothing like rebuilding a jump shot. There's no crowd to energize you, no buzzer to reset the moment, no coach calling a play that tells you exactly where to stand. There's just reality. Slow, stubborn reality. And for Antoine Walker, that reality came with two battles happening at the same time. The first was practical. How do you stabilize your finances, manage obligations, and rebuild credibility when the world has already decided you're the punchline? The second was psychological. How do you look in the mirror when the identity you wore for years, superstar, champion, provider, big spender, main character, no longer controls the room? That's when the pressure stops being public and starts becoming personal. Not because they lose talent, but because they lose context. In the NBA, every day has structure. You wake up, you practice, you travel, you compete. You're surrounded by professionals. Your goals are clear. Your role is defined, even when it changes. But when the league starts closing doors, structure disappears. And when structure disappears, the mind can spiral, especially if you're also dealing with public judgment. Antoine Walker had to confront something many people never have to face: the moment when your name is famous, but your power is reduced. That's a strange kind of loneliness. People still recognize you, but now they recognize you as the guy who... And then they attach the headline. Every introduction carries a shadow. Every conversation risks turning into a lecture from someone who thinks they know your life from a few articles. So how does Antoine Walker respond? One path is bitterness, another is silence. But Antoine Walker, over time, leaned toward something else: reframing. He began speaking about money, about mistakes, about the difference between earning and keeping. Not as a perfect role model, but as someone who understands the trap from the inside. And here's why that matters. When an athlete collapses financially, the public often assumes the athlete is careless. But rebuilding requires care. It requires discipline. It requires humility. It requires doing the unglamorous work: budgeting, cutting unnecessary costs, learning to say no, and separating real friends from fair-weather companions. It requires sitting with uncomfortable truths. the kind of truth that can't be drowned out by noise. This is also the chapter where we can explore Antoine Walker's post-NBA attempts to keep moving. For many former players, the transition includes playing in other leagues, exploring business ventures, doing media work, mentoring, or simply trying to find a new rhythm. The details differ, but the emotional pattern is the same. You're trying to rebuild purpose while rebuilding stability. And if Antoine Walker had been living for years with the constant stimulation of NBA life, the travel, the games, the attention, then learning to live in a quieter reality would feel like withdrawal, not from a substance, but from the adrenaline of importance. That's why some former stars chase new ventures too quickly. They aren't only chasing money, they're chasing the feeling of being needed. But what's remarkable about Antoine Walker's later phase is that his story began to shift from spectacle to lesson. He started warning younger players. He started emphasizing that the money can disappear faster than anyone wants to believe. He began talking about how quickly obligations pile up, how quickly the circle grows, how easy it is to confuse loyalty with unlimited spending. That shift is not just PR, it's survival. Because when your identity collapses, you either cling to denial or you build a new identity out of truth. And truth is difficult when it includes admitting that some of your instincts, the same instincts that helped you compete, also helped you self-destruct financially. So Antoine Walker's rebuild wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow. It was humbling. It was the kind of chapter that doesn't get the highlight reels, but determines whether a person becomes trapped forever in their worst moment or becomes larger than it. If you suddenly had everything, would you know how to keep it, or would you lose it trying to prove you deserved it? Antoine Walker's story is unsettling because it breaks the fantasy. The fantasy says talent equals security. The fantasy says a championship ring is a shield. The fantasy says that once you make over $100 million, you are permanently safe from ordinary problems. But Antoine Walker's life exposes the dark side of fame. Success can make you feel invincible right up until the moment it reveals how fragile you actually are. And the lesson isn't, don't enjoy your money. That's too simple, too moralizing, too cheap. The real lesson is deeper. If you build your identity on display, your spending becomes an emotional need. If you build your circle without boundaries, your generosity becomes a pipeline. If you trust momentum more than structure, you can turn even massive earnings into quicksand. That's why Antoine Walker is not just a story about luxury purchases. He's a story about psychology, about pressure, about the hunger to be seen, about the fear of being forgotten, about the way a young star can become a bank for everyone around him without realizing he's turning himself into a resource instead of a person. Think about the timeline. Antoine Walker rises fast, becomes a main character in Boston, tastes the peak of a championship run, and then watches the game change around him. Meanwhile, his lifestyle grows like it's permanent. His obligations pile up like they'll never be questioned. And because the checks keep coming for years, the warning signs can be ignored. That's what makes the collapse so sudden from the outside. It wasn't sudden, it was delayed. A delayed explosion. And when that explosion finally happened, the world reacted the way the world always reacts, with judgment, with jokes, with disbelief. But judgment doesn't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is a system that gives young athletes enormous money before giving them the emotional tools to handle what money does to relationships, identity, and self-control. So the question Antoine Walker's story leaves behind isn't just about him, it's about the viewer. Because if you strip away the fame, strip away the luxury, strip away the championship ring, the core warning becomes something anyone can understand. What you celebrate today can become what destroys you tomorrow if you never build a foundation underneath it. And here's the final haunting twist. Antoine Walker did not lose his career because he lacked talent. Antoine Walker did not lose his ring. Antoine Walker did not erase his basketball achievements. But Antoine Walker's financial collapse changed how many people remember him. That's the dark side of fame. It edits your legacy. So when the credits roll on this story, the viewer is left with one question that feels simple but is actually brutal. If you were handed Antoine Walker's life, the contracts, the attention, the power, the access, would you protect it with discipline? Or would you spend it trying to prove you belong? Because Antoine Walker's story suggests something most people don't want to admit. The money doesn't disappear because you're evil. It disappears because you're human. And fame makes human mistakes bigger than anyone expects.